When people first heard the name Fox Hollow Farm, they thought of beauty, peace, and privilege. Situated on the northern outskirts of Indianapolis, tucked away in Westfield, Indiana, the property was more than just a house, it was a statement. The sprawling estate covered nearly 18 acres, surrounded by woods that stretched out like a natural fortress. At the center of it all stood a large Tudor-style mansion with high peaks, dark wooden beams, and grand stone accents that seemed to whisper wealth and power. For locals, it was the kind of property you'd slow your car down just to catch a longer glimpse of. To anyone driving past, Fox Hollow Farm looked like the dream of an upper-class American family realized. The wide front yard was always manicured, the long driveway curved elegantly toward the house, and the swimming pool inside offered a touch of luxury that most people could only envy. It was the sort of place where you'd imagine summer barbecues, family gatherings, and children playing hide and seek in the trees. In fact, neighbors often referred to it as a storybook property, the kind you saw in glossy real estate magazines. But appearances, as history has shown us time and time again, can be deceiving. The farm carried an unsettling silence, one that went unnoticed by the people passing by. Unlike other properties in the area, it didn't carry the warmth of laughter, loud parties, or the sound of neighbors visiting. For all its beauty, Fox Hollow Farm had a stillness, almost like the land itself was holding its breath. To most, this detail didn't matter. People assumed the owners valued privacy. But that silence would later be remembered as the first sign of the horrors that lay within. The owner of this property, Herb Baumeister, wanted the world to see him as a man who had it all. A successful businessman. A father. A husband. The wealthy owner of a luxurious home. He carefully crafted this outward image, and the house itself became a part of his disguise. Fox Hollow Farm wasn't just where he lived, it was a mask he wore to hide the truth. Behind the grand Tudor facade and its towering rooflines, something unthinkable was happening. The farm that looked like a paradise in the daylight became something far more sinister at night. Hidden from view, its wooded acres would later be revealed as dumping grounds for human remains. The mansion, with its expensive architecture and polished interiors, held rooms where terror unfolded. It is chilling to think that while neighbors admired the beauty of the estate, just beyond the tree line, the soil was slowly filling with bones. Families who drove past, admiring the home's elegance, never suspected that its owner was hiding a sinister double life. The dreamlike charm of Fox Hollow Farm concealed one of the darkest secrets in Indiana's history. As investigators would eventually learn, the property was more than just a family home. It was a hunting ground. A carefully constructed stage where a predator played the role of a loving father by day, and by night, became something much more terrifying. Each wall, each acre of land, each shadowed corner of Fox Hollow Farm would later tell the story of a nightmare disguised as a dream. And so, what once appeared to be nothing more than a beautiful piece of real estate, would go down in history not as a symbol of wealth, but as a house of horrors. Herb Baumeister was a man who lived between two worlds, one carefully designed for public admiration, and another cloaked in secrecy and darkness. To the casual observer, Herb looked like a man who had achieved the American dream. He was a husband, a father of 3 children, and the co-owner of a successful business in Indianapolis called Save-A-Lot Thrift Stores. His sharp suits, confident smile, and expensive home at Fox Hollow Farm all reinforced the idea that he was not just another businessman, he was thriving. People who knew him casually described him as quirky, perhaps a little odd, but nothing alarming. He had a way of presenting himself that made others believe he was intelligent, ambitious, and focused. To his family, his neighbors, and his employees, Herb was the picture of stability. And yet, like so many infamous killers before him, this was only a facade. Behind closed doors, Herb's life was far from normal. He was a deeply troubled man whose behavior often unsettled those closest to him. His wife, Juliana, endured the brunt of his erratic moods. Herb could be cold, distant, and controlling, his temper often erupting without warning. The marriage was strained, yet outward appearances were always kept intact. They maintained their image as a respectable suburban family, hiding the fractures that ran beneath the surface. As the years went by, Herb's private world grew darker. While publicly presenting himself as a family man, he spent his nights frequenting gay bars in downtown Indianapolis. There, he used charm, manipulation, and alcohol to lure young men into his confidence. For many of his victims, he appeared as a wealthy man offering friendship, fun, or sometimes even employment opportunities. What they didn't know was that stepping into his car, or following him back to Fox Hollow Farm, would seal their fate. The stark contrast between Herb's two lives is chilling. By day, he could be seen attending Little League games with his children, helping run his business, or shopping in town with his wife. By night, he transformed into a predator, prowling bars and clubs for unsuspecting victims. He perfected this dual existence so well that even those closest to him remained blind to his secret for years. What made Herb even more disturbing was how ordinary he looked. Unlike the stereotypical image of a dangerous criminal, he blended effortlessly into society. He used normalcy as his greatest disguise. To the public eye, he was just another suburban father. But to the men who entered his world, he was something far more terrifying, a hunter hiding in plain sight. This double life also reveals something even more sinister about Herb's personality, his need for control. He controlled how people saw him, carefully curating the image of a successful, respectable man. He controlled his family, keeping them in check while hiding the most dangerous parts of his identity. And ultimately, he controlled the fate of the victims who trusted him, making sure that once they stepped into his hidden world, there would be no escape. The story of Herb Baumeister is not just about the crimes he committed, it's about how long he managed to keep up the illusion. For years, he fooled his neighbors, his business partners, even his wife, while carrying out one of the most gruesome killing sprees in Indiana's history. His life was a mask, and the smiling face he showed the world was nothing more than a cover for the monster lurking beneath. Fox Hollow Farm was the stage on which Herb lived both of his lives, the respectable family man and the merciless predator. And as investigators would later uncover, the cost of this double life was measured in human lives, buried in the soil of the very estate that symbolized his success. Every serial killer leaves behind a trail of victims, but what made the case of Herb Baumeister so disturbing was not just the number of men who vanished, it was how invisible those disappearances seemed to be for years. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, young men, mostly in their 20s and 30s, began vanishing from the Indianapolis area. Many of them were last seen in or around the city's gay bars and nightclubs. At first, their disappearances seemed random. Some families thought their sons had simply moved away, chasing new opportunities. Others assumed they had cut ties, as was common for members of the LGBTQ+ community at a time when acceptance was scarce. Police often dismissed these cases, believing the men had left by choice. But in truth, they hadn't gone anywhere. They had been lured into a trap. The pattern was chilling. A man would head out for a night of drinks, laughter, and dancing, just like any other night. Friends would see them leave the bar, often in the company of a tall, slightly awkward man who drove an expensive car. But that would be the last time anyone saw them alive. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, and eventually into years. No bodies, no witnesses, no answers, just silence. Families of the missing were tormented by uncertainty. Mothers filed police reports, fathers searched desperately for leads, siblings begged authorities to take the cases seriously. But again and again, they were met with indifference. The men who disappeared were often labeled as runaways, drifters, or people who simply wanted to start over elsewhere. Few realized that they had fallen into the hands of a predator who knew exactly how to blend into the shadows. Behind the walls of Fox Hollow Farm, these missing men became part of Herb Baumeister's secret life. He would lure them back to his estate, often under the pretense of continued partying or private drinks by the pool. But once inside his home, the atmosphere shifted. The mansion that seemed so elegant by day became a cage at night. Victims were trapped, cut off from the world, their final hours playing out in isolation with no one to hear their cries for help. It is believed that Baumeister targeted men who were vulnerable, those who might not have had strong family ties, or whose disappearances were less likely to trigger immediate, aggressive investigations. By exploiting society's neglect of the LGBTQ+ community, he was able to hunt almost unchecked for years. His victims, in many cases, were silenced not only by him, but also by a system that failed to protect them. The disappearances mounted. By the time suspicions began to form, at least a dozen men, perhaps even more, had vanished under eerily similar circumstances. Only later, when investigators began piecing the puzzle together, would the scope of the horror be realized. The missing were not gone by choice. They were buried in the soil of Fox Hollow Farm, their lives stolen by a man who hid his monstrosity behind a mask of normalcy. For the families left behind, the pain was unimaginable. They lived in a state of constant torment, never knowing what had happened to their sons, their brothers, their friends. Each missing person poster, each unanswered phone call, was a wound that never healed. And the cruelest part of all was that while they grieved and searched, Herb Baumeister continued living his double life, untouched, unsuspected, and ready to strike again. For years, the mystery of the missing men in Indianapolis lingered like a dark cloud. Families begged for answers, investigators struggled with dead ends, and the community grew uneasy. But the truth, the horrifying truth, lay buried just beneath the soil of Fox Hollow Farm, waiting to be uncovered. It began with suspicion. By the mid-1990s, Herb Baumeister's behavior had grown increasingly erratic, and his marriage was crumbling under the weight of secrets. His wife, Juliana, could no longer ignore the strange habits of her husband. Herb often disappeared for long stretches of time. He drank heavily, wandered the property at night, and insisted on privacy in areas of the estate, particularly near the woods. The smell of something foul sometimes drifted through the summer air, but Herb always had excuses: rotting animals, trash, or stagnant water. But Juliana began to see through the lies. In 1994, while walking the property with her son, she stumbled upon what looked like a human bone protruding from the ground. Disturbed, she brought it to Herb's attention. He brushed it off, claiming it was part of an old anatomical skeleton from his father's medical practice. It was a bizarre explanation, but Juliana, still uncertain and afraid of her husband's volatile temper, let it pass, for a while. Over time, the fear grew unbearable. The strange discoveries continued: bones, fragments, and objects that didn't seem to belong. By 1996, their marriage was collapsing, and Juliana made a fateful decision. She contacted the police. Her confession was chilling. She believed her husband might be hiding something horrifying on their property. When investigators finally arrived at Fox Hollow Farm, what they found defied belief. Scattered across the wooded acres and buried beneath shallow soil were thousands, yes, thousands, of human bone fragments. Skulls, vertebrae, ribs, femurs, each telling the silent story of a life cut short. The grounds were littered with remains so numerous that investigators had to sift through the soil like archaeologists at a crime scene. The discovery was both staggering and devastating. Piece by piece, the grim reality emerged: Fox Hollow Farm was not just a home, it was a burial ground. Authorities estimated that at least 11 victims had been disposed of on the property, though the true number may have been higher. The sheer volume of remains made it nearly impossible to identify every victim. Families who had waited years for answers were given only fragments of closure, sometimes literally, a single bone or tooth confirming their worst fears. Neighbors who once admired the grandeur of the estate now looked on in horror. The place they had envied for its beauty was revealed to be a house of death. The wide green lawns where children once imagined running and playing were, in reality, a graveyard. For investigators, the gruesome discovery was unlike anything they had seen before. The property became a labyrinth of evidence, with teams combing through dirt, brush, and bone fragments that stretched across acres. Each shovel of soil revealed more proof of Herb Baumeister's hidden life as a predator. The media quickly descended on Westfield, broadcasting images of investigators carrying boxes filled with human remains. The peaceful suburb was forever changed, its name linked to one of the most haunting crimes in American history. Fox Hollow Farm had kept its secret for years, but in the end, the earth could not stay silent. The victims who had been erased, discarded, and forgotten finally had their voices unearthed through the chilling evidence buried in the soil. The mask had been ripped away, and the nightmare was exposed for the world to see. By the summer of 1996, the walls were closing in on Herb Baumeister. The discovery of human remains at Fox Hollow Farm had blown open a case that investigators had been quietly piecing together for years. The missing men of Indianapolis were no longer just statistics or cold cases, they were victims of a predator hiding in plain sight. And now, all evidence pointed to Herb. The investigation intensified. Detectives gathered testimony, DNA evidence, and witness statements that tied Herb to the victim's last known whereabouts. Survivors who had narrowly escaped encounters with him began to speak out, recalling eerie nights when they, too, had been lured toward the farm, only to sense something was wrong and slip away. Slowly, the image Herb had carefully built for years, the family man, the businessman, the neighbor, crumbled into dust. At home, his marriage had collapsed beyond repair. His wife Juliana, terrified by what she had seen and deeply disturbed by the remains unearthed on their property, filed for divorce. She kept her children far from him, shielding them from the truth she herself was still struggling to accept. Herb was now isolated, abandoned by family, exposed to the world, and cornered by the law. Detectives prepared to arrest him, but Herb, ever aware of control slipping from his grasp, was one step ahead. He packed his car and fled Indiana, leaving behind the house of horrors that had sheltered his darkest crimes. He drove north, crossing into Canada under the guise of a quiet traveler in search of solitude. But what he was really searching for was escape, from justice, from shame, from the consequences of his monstrous actions. For weeks, he wandered the Canadian countryside, living out of his car, avoiding contact with strangers, and leaving behind cryptic signs of his presence. Investigators tracked his movements, but Herb stayed slippery, always moving, always watching. He knew the law was hunting him, and in a final act of control, he made sure they would never catch him alive. In July 1996, Herb Baumeister was found dead in Pinery Provincial Park, Ontario. Lying on the forest floor, his body bore the mark of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He had left behind a 3-page suicide note, but what was most chilling was what it didn't say. Herb rambled about his failing marriage, his business troubles, and his struggles with depression. He admitted to nothing. Not a single word about the men whose lives he had stolen. Not an ounce of remorse for the families who had suffered for years. Not even the faintest acknowledgement of the horrors buried back at Fox Hollow Farm. With his death, Herb robbed investigators and families of a trial, of confessions, of answers. The full truth of how many men he killed died with him in that forest clearing. The remains at Fox Hollow Farm told part of the story, but gaps would remain forever. Some families would never know for sure what happened to their loved ones. Herb had silenced them once in life, and again in death, he silenced the possibility of justice. His downfall was not the dramatic courtroom reckoning that many had hoped for. Instead, it ended in a quiet act of cowardice, far from the estate where his crimes had played out. But the ripples of his actions continued to spread, leaving devastation in their wake. The Baumeister name was destroyed. The community of Westfield was scarred. And the Fox Hollow Farm estate would forever be remembered not as a mansion of wealth, but as a monument to horror. In the end, Herb Baumeister escaped handcuffs, but he could not escape history. His legacy was sealed, not as a businessman or father, but as one of Indiana's most notorious serial killers. After Herb Baumeister's death, Fox Hollow Farm was no longer just a piece of prime Indiana real estate. It became something much darker, an open wound, a place where horror and tragedy seemed to linger in the very walls, the soil, and the air itself. Neighbors who once admired the property now avoided it. The sprawling Tudor mansion, once seen as a symbol of wealth, became infamous as a house of death. Reporters swarmed the estate, calling it Indiana's House of Horrors. For the families of victims, it was sacred ground and a graveyard, a place where their loved ones had been silenced. And for others, Fox Hollow Farm soon took on an even stranger identity, a place haunted not only by its history but, many believe, by the restless spirits of those who died there. As years passed, the property was sold, and new owners moved in. But they quickly discovered that the horrors of Fox Hollow Farm were not confined to history books. Strange things began to happen, things no new homeowner could prepare for. Voices echoed through empty rooms. Shadows flickered in hallways where no one was standing. Doors creaked open in the dead of night. The indoor pool, where Baumeister was believed to have killed some of his victims, became a hotspot of terrifying activity. Visitors reported feeling watched, as though unseen eyes followed their every movement. Some even claimed to see apparitions, figures of men fading in and out of existence, sometimes dripping with water, as if forever bound to their final moments. One chilling story involves the sound of splashing water and muffled cries near the pool area. Guests described a heavy atmosphere, like the weight of sorrow pressing down on them, making it hard to breathe. Paranormal investigators who visited Fox Hollow Farm reported cold spots, electromagnetic fluctuations, and unexplained audio recordings, voices whispering in the dark, pleading for help. The land itself carries an eerie presence. The wooded areas where investigators once unearthed human bones are said to be unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive, oppressive, and watchful. Some visitors have claimed to stumble across bones that the official searches may have missed, grisly reminders that not every victim was fully recovered, and not every secret of Fox Hollow Farm has been revealed. Over time, the property has become a subject of fascination for true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators alike. It has been featured in documentaries, books, and even ghost hunting television shows. For some, it's a chance to confront the horror of Herb Baumeister's crimes. For others, it's a way of connecting to the spirits of the victims who never received justice. But beneath the curiosity lies a deeper truth: Fox Hollow Farm is not just a haunted house, it is a haunted legacy. The story of Herb Baumeister is a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary masks, that horror can dwell within beauty, and that even in death, some places remain marked forever by the darkness of human cruelty. Today, Fox Hollow Farm still stands, its Tudor walls casting long shadows across the land at sunset. To some, it is just a house. To others, it is a graveyard. And to those who believe, it is a place where the cries of the past still echo, refusing to be silenced. The victims may have been buried, but their presence is said to linger, ensuring that the horrors of Fox Hollow Farm are never truly forgotten.